We're excited to announce that our very own podcasting platform, Zencastr, has become a new sponsor to the show. Check out the podcast's discount link in our show notes and stay tuned for why we love using Zen for the podcast.
You're listening to the Archaeology Podcast Network.
This is the CRM Archaeology Podcast. It's the show where we pull back the veil of cultural resources management archaeology and discuss the issues that everyone is concerned about. Welcome to the podcast.
Hello and welcome to the CRM Podcast, episode 212. You'll notice that I'm not Chris. This is Doug standing in for him for today. Chris is enjoying, I believe, the warm weather down in, well, not quite Cancun, but Chichen Itza, I believe, which is pretty close to it. So he's not going to be with us today, but we have several of the other hosts with us. We have Bill in California.
Hello.
We have Heather, also in California.
Hi, everyone.
And we have Stephen in Calgary.
Hello.
All right. Thanks, everyone, for joining us this week. So we're going to kick off on the topic of PhDs and CRM. And I'm going to throw it over to Heather, who recently saw a pretty interesting documentary, which is got us talking about this subject. So, Heather, if you mind filling us in a little bit on what you saw.
Sure. So, this documentary it really interested me when I saw the topic. It's called The Death and Rebirth of the PhD. And because, I have a real passion for using PhDs in CRM because I do think they have a role. But I don't think in the current setup, it's really fashioned, the current academia environment, especially in archaeology or anthropology, that it's set up well for PhDs to contribute well or to be successful in CRM. I think in some areas it definitely is the case. There are some extremely well-respected and successful firms that do have PhDs that are on staff. We have some PhDs on our staff, but in general, it is few and far between. And I think that along with, it's very consistent with a lot of what we've talked about on other programs, is that academia is not setting students up, whether they be undergrads, master's students, or PhDs, are not setting students up for success, which is what a university, what academia should be doing, is setting people up to get a job, period. And a job should not be limited to a postdoc and chasing postdocs for the rest of your career. So this documentary specifically focuses on the STEM PhDs and their transition into industry. So, there's a huge focus, and I definitely would like to hear Bill's perspective on this because he's the only one on this in the show with a PhD.
No, Doug does.
Oh,
Doug does
I'm
as
sorry,
well.
Doug.
Yeah.
Excuse me.
Yeah.
You know what? I knew that.
It's okay.
Sorry, Doug.
No, don't worry about it. Don't worry about it at all. It's something I don't advertise for certain reasons. So
fair enough.
Well, come on. But sorry, Heather, go back to what you were saying.
Yeah.
So you have Bill. I mean, you work at Berkeley. You're in that environment. You have Doug, and I knew better. I'm so sorry, Doug. But the academia is set up for the abuse of, and I can say this without having to make as many ramifications, I guess, as Doug and Bill, but it is indentured servitude, basically, of the students, the PhD students, and once they get their PhD, the postdoc environment, and it is meant to, and this documentary does a really good job of explaining that, and because of that, it doesn't encourage PhDs to have a path towards industry. And the documentary really talks a lot about the worth, the value that PhDs can have in industry. And I absolutely believe that. I mean, I have a friend of mine that has recently started working for us. He used to be a professor at University of Penn, and he is a research scientist for us. And he's invaluable to me. His place in our company is great. He's never been, he hasn't really been exposed to the regulatory side of things, but he's learning. I mean, he's obviously a smart guy, and that's something that's not going to be hard for him to pick up. But even if he were not to do that, his value in our company is great, because I wish I had the time to do some, a really well sussed out background for areas that we work in. I really think we should be contributing. This isn't just about, checking a box in, by providing a report to an agency. We do have a responsibility to push our discipline forward. But when you have background research and the background context in these reports that is not incorporating the ongoing research that's happening and really keeping the thumb on, new advances or new thought, new theory, it does a disservice to the reports that you have there. And I just don't have the time to do that. And I wish I did. And honestly, I'm not as qualified as my colleague is to write out a background. I could write out a really good background, and I have done that many, many times, but he can do even better background than I could. And so that's just one of many different values that he has also, putting together, having another set of eyes, another perspective on research designs and work plans. I mean, his value is, it's just, it's important. So this just inspired me watching this documentary. And I think it's especially valuable to CRM, I think in a different way, because I don't think that the transition as easy probably, but I think that there are some systemic issues in academia when it comes to the graduate degree, and specifically with why people go into a PhD program. I mean, I think the reasons people go into PhD program is part of the reason why they're not going to be successful in CRM. And also that the environment that they're in just perpetuates those same desires and starts creating a personality, a separate professional academic personality in the PhD students that make it even more difficult for them to get a job once they are finished, if they do want to go into CRM. So that is a really long way of segueing or introducing the topic. But I have so much other stuff that I would, like to talk about, but I'm going to open it up to my co-hosts and see what you guys have to say first.
Should I go first, Doug? I'll go first.
Yeah, go for it, Bill. Go for it, man. I like the deep sigh right before you start to speak. This should be good.
We need the disclaimer, right? That everything that I say is not reflected of the University of California system. That I love Oski Bear, and I especially love my paycheck. And it's a beautiful campus full of the brightest people in the universe, and whatever I have to say is no reflection of the actual institution in which I work. But I mean, I agree with some of the things that they're saying here. One of because I worked in CRM for a long time, where the goal is extremely simple. You have a contract with these boundaries, do the best you can to accomplish the company goals for this project, right? So, every time you have a CRM project, there's just a project area and rules that we're supposed to follow, and we have X amount of dollars and X amount of hours to get the project done, and we just do the very best that we can within the given amount, and then we're on to the next project. And the bigger ones take multiple years, but the shorter ones, we're out there for a single day, and we have until Friday to finish the entire project, right? But any which way you cut it in CRM, the mission is pretty straightforward. You're giving your professional opinion and doing the very best you can to, give advice on how to protect or how to avoid impacts to valuable heritage sites, right? So after you've done that for a long time, you get into this kind of mission mentality of well, what's our goal? Well, our goal is to provide professional opinions and do ethical archaeology and do the very best that we can. And then also, if we don't stay within these boundaries, then there's no company because we lose money, and then there's no archaeologist, and all of us have to find another job, right? So that's the impact. Do a bad job and you no longer have a job. And then, do the best job that you can, and the company stays afloat and you can pay your bills. Well, that's not really how it is in academia, because there is no incentive to there is no boundaries, right? Like the state gives X amount of money, and then students give X amount of money. And then, the goal is all over the place, right? Like, so are we supposed to have an obligation to the communities in which we live because we work at land grant institutions? Is it to achieve, total excellence in scholarship and rise to the top, that way? Is it to provide learning experiences so that people can leave and go get jobs? And every department is going in a million different directions, right? And so in the United States, and also the individuals who are in charge are not necessarily like the best at their job. And then sometimes they're so extraordinarily, amazingly well equipped, but then they're stuck in these positions where they don't have power, right? So you can have people who are excellent administrators, but they're at these mid-level or lower level positions with people who are just kind of like, people who are just doing whatever they can to promote their own careers and just selflessly creating extra work for every single person on all sides so that they can prove themselves and so that they can get raised up and raised to a higher level. So you've got an organization that's partially funded by the state. A lot of people think that the universities are funded by the government. They're not. They're not all the way funded by the government. In some states, they're not even funded by half of the money isn't even coming from the state. They don't have a clear goal because the clear goal is education. And we can turn on YouTube and sit here for long enough and learn something. So if education's the goal, education's laying around on all corners. We don't need universities. We don't even need public schools. If a person wants to learn, they can just learn in many different ways. So the goal can't be as simple as education. And it's definitely not raising to the highest levels of scholarship, because all the other activities that are going on in the university that take us away from that goal, like all the different meetings, being part of different committees, handling all this extra stuff that's off to the side, takes away from the goal of being the very best scholar, like Heather was mentioning, the research archaeologist, right? It takes away from us being 100% scholars, right? Because we have to do all this other admin stuff. And so you've got this system that's kind of flawed, and it depends on the department whether they want to aim towards teaching skills to get students to learn how to do archaeology, or whether they want to focus on something else. Or what happens almost every other time is everybody has their own vision of what they want the department to be, and they're all going in like 90 different directions. Some people are pushing students to go to excellence as far as reading a bunch of books and being really good at writing stuff that no one's ever going to read, right? And they just pound that into people's minds. Other people actually want people to learn skills in the field, and so they're kind of focusing more on methods and having people be out there so that those people will be, great at doing field archaeology, but then they never spend any time writing or doing any of the background research to become that higher level scholar. Or, some people are just like, they only want to be there because they have been there for so long and they just want to sit there and talk about their own research and things they think are interesting. And they don't care about whether students think it's interesting, whether it's making a contribution to the world or anything, because they're a very top level scholar. And just whatever, somehow when we sit in a room with them, we're supposed to be getting something that's invaluable. And so they're just absolute, not just elitists, they're like kind of Hollywood stars where they just sit around and talk and you don't really get anything from it. And the university pays them tons because they fill entire audiences and stadiums full of students, and everybody reads their stuff when they're on, all these different, CNN and on the Today Show and stuff, and they're totally famous, and it doesn't matter whether you learn anything. And all of that stuff goes into the same hopper, right? And so students show up and they may have a goal that they want to be an archaeologist, or they may have a goal that they want to be a professor, but there's no one there who is actually, in fact, focusing that down, showing them the exact skills that they need to learn, and then walking them through that, right? And also, on the other hand, the people who end up going into the PhD, and Doug can attest to this too, there's a group of people who are part of your same cohort that want to be that Hollywood, sit in the room and just talk and let people, throw money at them. And they don't care. Like, they don't care about...
You mean the egomaniacs?
Yeah. They want to be hyper famous, and that's all they want to do. And you can see it. They think that they've gotten to a PhD, and from whatever town they're at, or maybe their parents were also, amazing scholars or something like that. So they're pushing this person, and the person is actually just not connected to reality. Yes. They believe that at the end of the day, someone is going to come out of the audience with a tenure track position once they finish their first year of PhD, and they'll be off. And the next thing you know, you'll see them doing the circuit, going to Cambridge and Oxford and Harvard and all around, just, talking and filling stadiums. And they totally believe that. I think the biggest problem is that so many people come into a PhD and they think they're all going to be a tenure track professor.
That's the big lie.
Everything of their identity is poured into this.
Yeah.
From every side, everyone tells them the true measure of success is to become a tenure-track professor. And when these people realize the reality that you have slightly worse odds of winning the Powerball than becoming a tenure-track professor in the United States, their entire worldview is just crushed. They're just completely crushed because they're in there with these egomaniacs. They're in there with people who don't care. And then there's a couple of people who will help them along the way. They're trapped with their own cohort of people who they all want to make it. They all think that they're going to go tenure track, and they're all totally racked with anxiety and racked with all kinds of stuff because, they're trying to make every professor happy, do every single thing that the university says happy, and then also produce scholarship. Like, it's just really stressful. And a lot of people aren't cut out for it. And a lot of people crack, and a lot of people are no fun to be around.
It perpetuates the abusive environment because people, anytime you have desperation like that, it perpetuates. And it is a lie. This is something that's been happening for the last few. This has been happening. My dad is a PhD in high energy theoretical physics. This has been an issue. He had a hard time finding a tenure track position 50 years ago. So this is something that academia has continued to lie about for many, many years.
I don't think academia is lying. I think when you get there, they tell you straight up. Like when I went to Arizona, they just told us there's 13 of you in the room. 2 of you are going to get a tenure track position.
Then why are they admitting people into the PhD program if there isn't it's not because, these people want the tenure track position. It's because they want the free labor. It's because I take that back. Yeah, you're right. There's some professors that pretty much do want just the free labor. But I think that at the end of the day, almost everybody who is pragmatic and not a superstar understands that someone with a PhD has a lot of skills. And because they've gone through the grinder of research, they can apply themselves in ways that people who have not gone through that cannot. And they are very valuable for the economy. Every single country, all their PhDs are really valuable to every country's economy. Taught how to turn that into a job like that, though.
Well, the key is to tell them that they're not just going to be a professor, and to let them know, like, look, man, if you get this job, that's great, but it's still going to be a job at the end of the day. However, you are a really valuable person, and you're very smart, and you're doing amazing stuff. That should be good enough, and you're going to go out there and you're going to take the things that you learn here and apply them in a job. And it may be tenure track, and it may not be. But at the end of the day, yeah, you're right. It's great that you have a PhD. That is something special. Now, don't fixate on one solitary goal for your entire life. Instead, try to have a better life.
I have a question for you, Bill. So, and Doug. So if that's the case in archaeology, why is it that there is a shy away from teaching the regulatory process and any kind of skill set that would encourage PhD students to go in and be successful in CRM? Because that is the industry for us. That is the industry. Yes, there are some other, if you were to have a PhD in anthropology, there's a much more broad application of your skill set and your knowledge to separate, different industries. But for most part, CRM is the industry that PhD students have for their other option, their other, the fork in the road that they could go into CRM. How come they're not being prepared to do that?
That is an excellent question. We have to go to break, but when we come back on the other side, I think a couple of us have some comments on that.
Chris Webster here for the Archaeology Podcast Network. We strive for high-quality interviews and content so you can find information on any topic in archaeology from around the world. One way we do that is by recording interviews with our hosts and guests located in many parts of the world all at once. We do that through the use of Zencastr. That's Zencastr. Zencastr allows us to record high-quality audio with no stress on the guest. Just send them a link to click on, and that's it. Zencastr does the rest. They even do automatic transcriptions. Check out the link in the show notes for 30% off your first 3 months, or go to zencastr.com and use the code CRMARC. Looking to expand your knowledge of X-rays and imaging in the archaeology field? Then check out An Introduction to Paleoradiography, a short online course offering professional training for archaeologists and affiliated disciplines. Created by archaeologist, radiographer, and lecturer James Elliott, the content of this course is based upon his research and teaching experience in higher education. It is approved by the Chartered Institute for Archaeologists as 4 hours of training. That's in the UK, for those of you that don't know. So don't miss out on this exciting opportunity for professional and personal development. For more information on pricing and course structure, visit paleoimaging.com. That's PALEO imaging.com, and look for the link in the show notes to this episode.
Welcome back from the break. So Heather dropped I'm not going to say a bomb, but a healthy debate question at the end of the last section. So first up, Stephen, you had some thoughts on this.
Yeah, and it kind of ties in with the direction I think Bill was going. So Bill, if I'm misreading you, feel free to jump in and correct me. I feel like what Bill's getting at is the whole point of getting a PhD. I mean, aside from the fact that you develop like an expertise in a very, very specific topic, is that you develop the skills that are applicable to a broad range of career paths, jobs, projects, whatever you want to, however you want to take it. And I feel like the big thing about Heather's thoughts, and I feel like she's coming at it because she hires people. So she wants, like, give me the best trained people you possibly can. And most of the people with PhDs aren't it. But I feel like that's kind of making the same mistake as people who go into a PhD because they want to become a professor. It's the idea that these things have a specific job training purpose when they really don't. They run you through the grinder. You learn a lot of skills that are applicable on a broad range. And they tie into other jobs, whether they happen to be CRM, whether they happen to be professorial, whether they happen to be, I don't know, like middle level manager for some other company, right? And so as a skilled training perspective, that's really not why you do a PhD. I mean, we can debate whether like the cost is worth it then. It's like, well, if I'm not going to make like an extra $50,000 a year, it's like, why am I forking out all this cash to, kill myself? But at the same time, I feel like there's that weird refocus of like, no, this needs to be training for the private sector because these are the only type of jobs you can get. And that's the same sort of thinking, but with a different end goal. And I think that's a mistake.
I totally agree with you, actually.
Yeah, and to go back to schools not teaching CRM, a lot of schools do.
Not well.
So I'm not sure, like, we can blame Bill because he's not, for some reason, like, none of his students are reading his blog or something. But generally, a lot of programs, I said most, but I don't actually have numbers. But a lot of programs that I'm familiar with do, in fact, have at least, a moderate amount of CRM, like a course, some sort of internship, and some of them even have programs still.
There are some out there, but they are still not. I was at a school, which I think it's a great school. It prepared me for a lot, but they had one CRM course, and that's a majority of schools have one CRM course. And that CRM course is typically a case study course. They go over regulatory in general, and they talk NEPA. And if you're in California, they may talk CEQA. And then they go through a case study, and you kind of take about 3 or 4 case studies over the quarter or the semester, and you figure out how to implement a regulatory understanding in a practical manner. And there's just no way you can do that in one course, introduce to regulatory and then implement it or apply it all in one semester. It just doesn't, or a quarter. It's just not enough. It's not enough.
I don't think it needs to be, because, just because you get a PhD does not make you qualified to be the boss. You're not like a PI just because you have a PhD, right? Like there is a certain amount of on-the-job training, and this is regardless of whatever career path you happen to be on. And like you need to know that it's a thing. You need to know that there are regulatory requirements, and the reasons we're doing these things that we're doing are because of regulatory requirements. But there's a certain amount of like you're going to have to sit down and write a report for the first time. You're going to have to sit down and plan a project for the first time.
But I shouldn't have to be training people from scratch. And I actually have more of an issue with some of the intangible qualities that kind of are not encouraged in a terminal degree that actually are perpetuating some of these traits in people that are not transferable over to the industry or CRM. And, you're attracting people who really, as a CRM professional, you have to be a lot of things. So you have to be a diplomat, you have to be a business manager, you have to be a trainer. There's so many aspects in CRM that you need to cover. And so these are, a lot of times, PhD students, it's because they really do want to and I think it's great because we need people in the society that are willing to sit and think about these things that none of the rest of us have enough time to think about and to really come up with some answers. We need that, and we can't lose that in the society. I think there's a huge value for PhD students. But my main issue is not that we have PhD students or we need that. It's that we're pumping so many out that there's just not enough jobs and places for them to go. And so I think that there needs to be some focus on allowing them to create those skills that they need in order to go into the industry if that's what they choose to do.
Yeah. I feel like, though, one of the things is that, like, in any given academic track, there aren't enough jobs in those particular fields. Like, that's not how that works, right? Like, it's not like, oh, we have 5 jobs, so we're going to allow 5 students in. Right. That's not how education works. That's not how life works, right?
I understand, but how do you get people to actually go into the PhD? I mean, a lot of people, you talk about somebody who's in a master's program or just an undergraduate program that goes straight into a PhD program. What are they, what is their purpose for going into a PhD program? 80% of them will tell you it's because they want to become a professor. It's not until they're into the PhD program that they start getting a dose of reality that's not going to happen. And by then, they've already committed themselves to this lifestyle.
So 2 answers to that. First of all, 80% will say that they want to become a professor, but 100% of the professors got PhDs. So the only way you can even become a professor is to have a PhD, right? So,
True.
In that regard, if everyone says, well, no, that'll never, ever happen to you. I mean, I'm one of the people who never thought that I would become a professor, right? So I didn't get into the PhD to become a professor, but I'm totally glad that it ended up happening because I am the kind of person that should be a professor, right? Someone who actually recognizes both Stephen and Heather's opinions on what should happen to folks when they do archaeology. But then the other thing too is not everybody's going to finish a PhD program, right? I mean, there's a lot of people who get in and they're like, oh man, like what have I done to myself? And there's actually nothing wrong with not finishing a PhD. I mean, the only thing that's wrong is if you don't get at least a master's degree out of your PhD. But even that still, when you're in, you can get back into another PhD if your life changes and you have to take a pause on your PhD and then come back. Like there's no shame in not finishing it all at once, right? Like there's no shame in not eating an entire large pizza all at once. Some people are going to do it, but not everybody. You don't have to do it, right?
Bill, speak to yourself. There's some great shame in not finishing that large pizza.
I know this is going to get us off the point, but someone mentioned on Facebook that they asked their students, because they were doing the garbology project in their archaeology class, and they had a bag of pizza rolls. And the students were kind of confused on whether that was a family serving of pizza rolls or whether that was just for one person. And I guess many of the students in the class have eaten 30 pizza rolls at once. And so they're kind of like, that's just a small, appetizer here. What are you talking about for a whole family? Why would I ever share it? So I guess you're right. I guess some people will eat an entire large pizza and that's just what happens, right? So maybe that's a bad analogy. But getting back to the thing, we're not, just like Stephen was saying, we're not the ones who decide whether someone should try to become a professor or they should try to get a PhD or any of that stuff. It's not irresponsible for us to tell people that they should not, because many of the people who, the ones that you don't think will do, amazing work, end up being, extraordinary scholars. And it was this environment that they came into the PhD.
But we do decide. You do decide. People are denied from PhD programs all the time. So there is a decision not to accept. Right.
Yes, you're right. And of the people who are PhD students, we're not the ones to tell them they're not going to become a professor. That's kind of, I don't know what to say. That's a sad thing for someone to be like, oh, well, you'll never do that, and just look at you. I mean, the reason why I have a PhD is because some jackasses told me a long time ago that I wasn't going to be worth anything. Mm-hmm. And so I ended up powering through. And then who's laughing now, right? Who's laughing now? Anyway.
Dude, that's like 2/3 of people in PhDs, like programs, have been told that they're never going to make anything of it. But that's like all of Twitter is like, look at me now that I have a job. And then name calling like the person who told them that. Well,
a job of doing what?
Well, I never did that.
An adjunct professor running around at 5 different colleges teaching at $5 an hour, unfortunately.
I do agree that we should maybe talk about that in the last segment, because that is the true crippler, that there aren't as many tenure track positions because so many people are getting these adjunct jobs, and it goes back to the thing of professor being the key thing of their identity, that they're willing to take any level of abuse from the university system to say that they're teaching. Like they'll accept anything, in the world until a while later, after they've been abused and all this damage and trauma has happened to them, they realize like, oh, they were just using me. Meanwhile, at that same university, the people who used to fund it fully in the state legislature are like, well, that's amazing that you still were able to keep the doors open with this. How about we cut a little more and see what happens? And then the other people that I was saying, the administrators that want to move on to dean and provost at another university, are just squeezing the department. They get the results. They show those results to another university. Then they hop on a gravy train and go to another university. And so those two, like the whole business system of the university, is something we haven't even mentioned yet.
That's my question is, how do you think the funding? I mean, the funding has a huge part of this. Where do they get their funding? The grants that these tenure professors are bringing into the university. I mean, that's a huge driver behind a lot of these behaviors.
Yeah, but there's people who have, and it's hard for any of us to understand, more money than they know what to do with. And one of the things that they can do is give it to a university with their name on a building and a whole bunch of other stuff so that they don't have to pay taxes on it, but also so that they can feel good that they gave something back to the university where they went. And there are some departments that have gotten huge. I mean, every single university, look at their business school, look at their law school, look at these other schools, right? Look at the medical centers in San Francisco that have Zuckerberg all over them, right? There's people who have cash, they're from a town, and they just dump it into a university. They get their name on the side, and a huge chunk of that will go to a department, right? And so one thing is to try and find huge donors. Now, archaeology isn't one of those ones that really, I'm hoping that someone here on this podcast will be the first one to get their name on an anthro building somewhere. But we're not the ones who have hundreds of millions to not pay taxes on that we're going to give to an anthro department. But there are people who are out there, and there are departments who get that chunk. And so that's one chunk of where that money's coming from, donors, right? There's another chunk that comes from the government. There's a way smaller chunk that comes from the NSF, because when you get an NSF grant, let's say we got $100,000 or $1 million, let's say $1 million, and everyone would pat us on the back. Well, the university is going to jack half of that just off the top, right? So there goes half of your money. And then it's not like you're going to be able to put that into your department. You got to put it into your research. So you can put it into the department in the way of like getting equipment or hiring students or something like that. But there's no way you could just build an endowment, right, to cover the wages of an adjunct or to get more admin staff, right? Those funds are earmarked for research. So you're not allowed to actually improve your department with the money that's coming in. So those donors and the money, and then students, how many students you have enrolled in your department is, a huge indicator of how much money you've got. And if you're pre-med and you've got tons and tons of students, or if you're, another department that's huge, like a required course that's got, these huge stadium-sized classes that people have to all take, they're level 1. I mean, that's a huge way that you get cash. So however many majors you can get, That's another thing, because you've got more humans in that department. That means more professors, more admin to manage those professors, right? So the departments that have the most students are the ones that have cash. So students, donors, and then a little bit of state funding. That's how departments exist.
Tell me if I'm wrong on this one, Bill or Doug, or well, any of you, Steve. So, the NSF grant, yes, does the department get much out of that? They do, but not to the degree that people would think. They're not getting that whole chunk. However, what does it do? It benefits that one professor who wrote that grant that got that NSF. Okay, so it goes back to that discussion that you were having earlier, Bill, is that selfish attitude, the selfishness of, or just the scrambling. I'm not even going to make this a malice thing. I mean, the scrambling of just trying to continually keep your head above water and to make yourself appear valuable to the department, to the university by getting that grant. So that helps. It may help one person. It may not help the department much, but it helps that one tenure track professor who was able to get that grant. And that's what I'm saying a lot of times perpetuates some of this bad behavior and this abusive behavior, is this nonstop scrambling on top of another topic, which we could say for something else, on top of this concept that when we're critical of data, we have unfortunately conflated that with being critical of people. And so it's become this, this ugly environment that sometimes can just permeate an entire department, which along with all the other issues just makes it, very difficult for not only people to be happy and to have a good life, but also to get out of the situation if it's not going to be beneficial for them.
So on that very cheery note, we'll come back to it, but let's go to a break and we'll continue this discussion on the other side.
You may have heard my pitch for membership. It's a great idea and really helps out. However, you can also support us by picking up a fun t-shirt, sticker, or something from a large selection of items from our TeePublic store. Head over to arcpodnet.com/shop for a link. That's arcpodnet.com/shop to pick up some fun swag and support the show.
All right, and we're back for the last segment of this podcast. I'd like to do a little bit of riffing off of Heather's comments there. This actually probably goes back to the beginning of this last segment with some comments that Stephen had made and a lot of things that various people have raised. I think a lot of frustration that comes with the interaction between, say, industry and academia when it comes to PhDs is that, there's a lot of momentum behind our current way of doing teaching. It's written right into the Secretary of Interior's regulations. Like, you must have a master's degree to be able to become permitted to do anything in the Secretary of Interior. Basically, if you're going to do archaeology, CRM archaeology in the US, you pretty much have to have at least a master's to get anywhere in your career. I'm sure there's plenty of exceptions of some people who've managed to, do no degree or a BA and have a very successful career. But in general, it's a stopping sort of point. So we have a lot of momentum behind the current system, but the current system hasn't changed in almost ever. I mean, there's been incremental changes, probably none for the better. I mean, the very first PhD was 6 pages long. So if you can imagine that, like, you could get, back when the first one came out, I'm pretty sure it was Yale, all you had to do was 6 pages. And that got you a PhD. And now, people have PhDs that are 600 pages long. And that's not an exaggeration at all. But it's a system, and it's a system that's basically almost unchanged. And to be honest, like, a PhD is a really crappy apprenticeship. Like, if you look at modern apprenticeships, they're so much better at training and working on people, whereas a PhD is basically an apprenticeship from the 1800s, not very well done at all, and actually probably worse than a lot of other apprenticeships. It's probably giving apprenticeships in the 1800s a bad name. But in a sense, like, this is sort of going back to something Stephen said, where, like, a PhD trains you and gives you a lot of transferable skills. I don't think it actually does. There's a lot of things that go into it, and you do gain some skills, but honestly, on the range of skills that you gain, most PhDs are not at all structured. Like if you had a very structured system, you could gain a whole huge range of skills. But then to flip back to that is like your PhD is not designed to teach you skills. Like I know, Heather, you were bringing up points about like all the different classes you're supposed to take, but like your PhD, actually doing your PhD, there are no courses you take. So like in the UK, there's 3 years and you might take like a single sort of weird research halfway workshop sort of things, a couple of those, but there is actually no courses whatsoever in a PhD. And basically in the United States, you have your first sort of 2 years, which are courses, which is actually just a master's. It's a taught master's that you do. And if you do well enough, you continue on to a PhD, at which point it's almost mostly self-directed, or basically they drop you out at a master's or nothing. So like that's your first part. So honestly, there is no scope in the current design of a PhD to actually add much more. I mean, you'd have to completely redo how PhDs are done. And that's really hard because as been brought up a couple of times, I think Bill's brought it up as well, is like the people who are teaching are basically teaching what they've been taught, and that's how to do a PhD. And a lot of them haven't actually worked anywhere else or done anything else. And I mean, it's tough because, you know, in the United States, you have to get a degree from an accredited college. To get accreditation, the colleges take several years, tons of money, all sorts of stuff like that. And so the system's self-perpetuating because to get accreditation, you basically have to follow a very similar pattern. So you can't just like completely change how you do degrees. But I don't know, if there wasn't all that momentum, if there wasn't all those regulations, I would not be surprised if, you know, some new sort of training system came along and sucked up most of the students from the universities, because the universities have a very particular way of doing things. It's self-perpetuating because it's how they've all been taught. And then it's actually written into basically most legislation and regulations now. So at a certain point, you basically have the system. But if you were to, say, design a better way of, say, training people, you would never choose to do like the way we set up the system is incredibly inefficient. You would never, if you had to create an education system from scratch, you would probably never do the university system. It's a legacy of things coming out from basically, well, you know, 1,000 years ago, and religious teachings and the church is how we've ended up with what we have now. And it's a development system, but I see the frustration with, you know, PhDs not providing industry with the staff they need at the skill level that they want, but they're completely not designed to do that. And I don't see that changing anytime soon. I would see it more likely that someone figures out some other system that somehow manages to, I don't know, hack degrees in some way. Somehow they figure out a way to be able to get accredited, and whatever that becomes takes over and sucks up a lot of people who are looking for jobs. But I don't know. I guess I might be a bit pessimistic, but I don't see that the system's been there. It's been there for hundreds of years. It's developed in a certain way. I don't see it changing anytime soon. And I can see that like pretty much everyone has their hand up for saying stuff. And I have no idea who wants to go next.
Bill goes next. I said Bill had his hand up
Okay,
first.
Bill.
Well, I mean, you're practicing the way we got to do it, because if you look at the screen, the folks who don't know this, like when we're recording here, there's stuff that's going in the chat, and if you look at the screen when you're talking, then you're going to get distracted and you won't speak into the microphone. So that's how Doug could he's not looking at the screen, because if he is, then he'll see our comments, and so that's how we could go on. But I do agree with Doug. First of all, I guess I agree with Stephen and Doug that, first of all, there's not a way for the universities to teach people everything they need to know for every single company and, Forest Service unit, because they're all done, just that much differently. And the stuff that you would learn in the Southwest is not necessarily going to be applicable in Alberta. And so you'll always have to be relearning several things. But the process is learning itself, right? And not just learning, but learning at a higher level than at the undergrad level. I mean, you're in there with a lot of different people with a range of different abilities and familiarity with academic processes. And so we can't just make these classes so that they're just simple Scantron click bubbles and stuff. I mean, that's pretty much what folks were doing in high school, but we can't open it fully up to, PhD level of 3 months of self-directed learning about something of archaeology, because then a lot of these students won't even be able to they won't be able to finish the class, right? So the PhD, you end up being in that situation where you are self-directed and you're learning. However, I also agree with Heather and that there needs to be a little bit more structure. And Doug is exactly right. A lot of these PhDs programs, folks are just left to adrift. And depending on the advisor you have and your own personal ability and skills, like if you've done CRM, then it's kind of like goal-oriented, where you can just you need to do the research and you get the data and you're doing this and you analyze the artifacts and you move on, and then you got the carbon-14 dates, and then you've got a thing at the end. But a lot of folks don't have that kind of experience. And so they finish those first 2 years and they're considered a PhD candidate, but they're just left to like drift around and try to figure out something on their own. And if they have a great advisor that's helping them every single bit of the way, then, it should be fine. But if they're not collaborating with the advisor, if they're not showing up to meetings regularly, if, they're not in contact with the advisor, then they're kind of just doing their own thing off in the corner for, like Doug said, 4 years to do it. And the other thing about it too is I don't really see where these departments are. If the goal of 80% of the students is to become a professor, I don't really see where these departments are in any way preparing these students to actually become a professor, because they're not looking at the market of what, things that need to be taught, what universities are going to be hiring, what direction is the entire field going, and then trying to tell students, here are the openings. Here's the places where, universities are looking for folks who do this and do that and do this. So you should spend these 6 years kind of building your evidence that you know how to do that stuff so that you have a better chance of becoming a professor. They're doing what Doug just mentioned. They are teaching what they know. They're teaching, okay, when I did my PhD in the 1970s, I wrote a dissertation and it was based on artifacts and excavating and all this other stuff. Therefore, you shall do that same thing too. And in the 21st century, a lot of that stuff is not really applicable to the new university system. And the last thing I'd want to say about the entire endeavor of professors and the toxicity that's going on in departments, those professors that are running those departments a lot of times and that are your advisors are hurt people who have gone through a system where people have used them and abused them, and they've had all kinds of complications, plus the neurosis and anxiety of putting your entire own human identity into the job you do. So what you get is a person who is, fragile. They don't have emotional abilities. They have not worked through the 40 years of demons that they've had from these thoughts ruminating in their own minds and the harm that other people have done. And so they end up being these kind of people who are hurt, and they end up hurting the students too. And I'm not even talking about the ones who are criminal predators, right? Because that's also another thing. The university system is not designed to really fire people the second that they are, proven guilty of doing something wrong. There's all kinds of misconduct and unethical stuff that happens that just vanishes in the, rubric of all these pages and files and statements that happen. So predators and other people who are villains are able to exist in the university system for a long time. I mean, I'm not saying that the corporate world is much different, but this kind of stuff can happen. I'm talking about people who have suffered greatly that then believe that their students need to suffer. Like if you're not staying up all night long, I mean, it's dysfunctional, but I have a freaking bedroll in my office because when I'm tired, I just sleep for a couple hours or even 30 minutes and then work more rather than just going to sleep for an entire night like a normal human. I'll just lay on the ground next to my desk. That's the kind of person who is teaching these classes. That's the kind of person who's writing these books and doing all this kind of stuff. And that's not the kind of person that's functional that's not a normal way to live.
And you're one of the more balanced ones, Bill.
Well, it's because I'm being recorded right now. If you saw my real life.
So just to follow on, what I meant when it's a crappy apprenticeship, modern apprenticeships in the UK at the moment, if you do an apprenticeship, you're actually paired with your employer, you're paired with a college, a training provider, and there is a learning plan. Like over a year or two, or okay, it depends on the apprenticeship and how you're doing it and whatnot. You actually have a very set goals, but that's what I would say is a good modern apprenticeship. Whereas when you do a PhD, after those classes are done, I would be surprised. I'll ask Bill because maybe he did. Did you have a learning plan once you got through all your courses and what you're going to do with your PhD? Usually it's just, all right, you have a project, you kind of have some stuff you need to do. Yeah, come back. And it's really dependent on your advisor. They're like, we need to have scheduled meetings every week or every month or something like that. Then you do that. But if you don't have that structure, and that's it. I know most people who just sort of got dropped off in random places and were like, yes, come back to us in a couple of years with your thesis and we'll see how it goes.
Well, I have a really great PhD student who, it's amazing. He's a guy who's been doing CRM for a long time. And so for him, those meetings are kind of like, yeah, I'm working on it, my friend. Like, there's nothing really to report. So we don't really have regular meetings. I send him emails as much as possible, and we meet when we need to have contact. But I'm talking about folks who seriously need help. The person who's the student that I'm talking about right now already had an amazing career doing archaeology and then decided to get a PhD. So in a lot of ways, I see a lot of what I had going for me when I went into my PhD program, because I was kind of like, we don't really need to have meetings every day unless they're about work. And otherwise, I'll just get work done. Like, tell me the deadline and when it needs to get done, and I'll do it no matter what has to happen. So yeah, no, there is not a plan. I did not have a plan of what I was going to do after I finished my PhD. I wanted to be a principal investigator for a CRM company in Arizona, and you got to have a PhD to get a license from the Arizona State Museum. That was the plan.
Yeah.
I wanted to just kind of answer some of the really good points that Doug brought up. And the one thing is, you're talking about the classes. Yes, you have your classes, you have 2, maybe 3 years of classes, depending on how quickly you go through them. And then, like you said, you're on your own. And first of all, I know that because when I was kind of at my junction of, am I going to do PhD or am I going to go into a master's program? There were 2 options. I couldn't just go to a university, most of the ones in my area. And I was limited to my area because I was a single mom of 2 small children. And so I really did have to stick in my state, at least. And the options I had was either to go to a terminal master's program or to go to a PhD program that would not guarantee me a master's. So even if I finished all the classes and I did everything, they weren't in the business of a terminal master's. They were a business of PhD, and it was at their whim of whether or not they were going to give me that terminal master's if for some reason, because I was looking at all options, this was a second career for me, that if I were to decide at the master's that I really cannot continue to go on the PhD route because I have to take care of my children, would that be an option for me? And it was pretty much hands down no. So there is no, it's either PhD or bust, or you go into a terminal master's program. And I know that's not the case in all areas, and I know for sure it's not the case in Europe, but it is the case. And so that right there makes a decision for people, and they have to make a decision right off the bat rather than being able to be given that option partway through. And then, I think Stephen actually put a comment in the memos, which is a really good question. Are there certain topics that could be more directly applicable to working in CRM? And then, Bill was bringing up the focus on, you finish your classes and then you go, your next thing is you excavate and then you write on that, you do your analysis, and you're hyper focused on that. And I think, first of all, there are options. There are other ways we can think of making this better. And this is a big, huge cargo ship that's going to take forever to turn. But it doesn't mean we shouldn't be trying to get it in a different direction. And, one thing specifically is why are we always excavating? We can still create a work plan for excavation and not excavate. I think excavation is important. And I think obviously it is something, we've talked about this before as far as interning and field schools and the value of people, learning how to excavate and work in the field properly. But, what about the existing collections and the ethical responsibility we have to work on existing collections rather than continue to create large collections that PhD student is going to focus on that one collection and the rest of the assemblage that was recovered is never touched. It's stuck in boxes and stays there. We have a responsibility. These are all little things that we should be looking at things differently. And then, I know that it's a big thing to chew off, but the perspective regarding CRM is the same thing that just to bring this back to this documentary, is that, these PhD programs have this idea, this concept that you're selling out if you go to the industry in these STEM PhDs. And this is what is really shoved down the PhDs students' throats. And they are so insular. They have their own little world because they're now like at a lab, and it's the same thing happens to archaeology. I mean, you are so focused. And by the way, Bill, I do sleep on my desk too, so it's not any more balanced than CRM, but
it's like camping.
Yeah.
Well, guys, it's COVID. Everyone sleeps near their desk these days.
Right. True. Very good point. But this concept that CRM is sell out, or that for the STEM PhDs, that industry is selling out, and that CRM doesn't do good archaeology. It does do good archaeology. But that concept, that is what's being sold to the students in these PhD programs, and it vilifies the CRM world. And why would they, if that's all they know, why would they even think about going into CRM? I do think things are starting to open up a little bit, but it's wrong. That kind of message shouldn't be pushed, but it is continually being pushed. And I think that right there, that's a big part of what could be changed. And I think that CRM also has a responsibility to be reaching out to these and not just be looking at them as the other, as we say, but to be working, like someone like myself should be reaching out to someone like Bill and someone like Doug and really trying to forge that relationship together so we can benefit these students and look for ways to improve this whole system. And CRM has responsibility to it too.
So I think that's a good point to stop. Just for our listeners who are maybe listening to this in a couple of weeks or maybe a couple of years from now, we're recording this at the end of March. So Heather threw in a nice little pop culture reference there about turning a giant cargo ship. For you who maybe forget about this in a couple of years, 12% of the global trade has just been stopped because of the blockage in the Suez Canal. Good job on that reference there, Heather. Keep us cool.
I'm getting the hang of this podcast.
Yeah, man. Keeping us relevant with all the kids these days. So, with that, I think we're gonna call this episode and bring it to a close.
That's it for another episode of the CRM Archaeology Podcast. Links to some of the items mentioned on the show are in the show notes for this podcast, which can be found at www.arcpodnet.com/CRMArcPodcast. Please comment and share anywhere you see the show. If you'd like us to answer a question on a future episode, email us. Use the contact form on the website, or just email chris@archaeologypodcastnetwork.com. Support the show and the network at arcpodnet.com/members. Get some swag and extra content while you're there. Send us show suggestions and interview suggestions. We want this to be a resource for field technicians everywhere, and we want to know what you want to know about.
Thank you, everyone out there, for listening, and we'll see you in the field.
Goodbye.
Bye, everyone.
Is Steven dugging me? Is Steven dugging me right
He's
now?
dugging you. You're getting dug.
Oh,
I love it.
Steven.
Goodbye.
oh,
Oh, yeah.
oh, man. That was a bit brutal there, Steven. Man, that cuts a bit deep. Cool. I'm gonna stop us now.
You're about to fair play.
True. What goes around comes around.
This episode was produced by Chris Webster from his RV Traveling America, Tristan Boyle in Scotland, and the Archaeology Podcast Network, and was edited by Rachel Roden.
This has been a presentation of the Archaeology Podcast Network. Visit us on the web for show notes and other podcasts at www.archpodnet.com. Contact us at chris@archaeologypodcastnetwork.com.
Thanks again for listening to this episode and for supporting the Archaeology Podcast Network. If you want these shows to keep going, consider becoming a member for just $7.99 US a month. That's cheaper than a venti quad eggnog latte. Go to archpodnet.com/members for more info.